Hidden deep within the forgotten archives of Ulster County, New York, lies a sealed inspection report from 1867, an unassuming document that has unnerved every clerk bold enough to read it. It chronicles the systematic abuse and spiritual manipulation of 456 women over 3 decades inside the House of Religious Correction for Wayward Women. But the horror isn't just in what was done, it's in who did it. Patrick, Kathleen, and Sean Hudson convinced an entire town that their cruelty was divine will. Shielded by faith and bureaucracy, their crimes vanished from public memory, locked away by state order. Yet tonight, we're tearing open that silence to expose one of the most disturbing chapters in America's hidden past, a so-called sanctuary where salvation meant slavery. If you're drawn to the dark corners of history where faith turns into fanaticism, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And tell me what legends haunt your hometown. Drop a comment with your state or city. Maybe your story will be next. The Hudson family's nightmare didn't begin with madness. It began with devotion. In the 1830s, New York was gripped by religious revival. The Second Great Awakening swept through towns like wildfire, igniting new movements, moral crusades, and reform institutions. Communities believed sin could be cured with prayer discipline and divine intervention. Ulster County, nestled in the Hudson River Valley, was no exception. Its county seat, Kingston, was a beacon of virtue. 13 churches, 4 temperance societies, and strict Calvinist values passed down through generations of Dutch farming families. These were people who believed that spiritual decay, like disease, could infect entire communities, and that radical measures were sometimes necessary to stop it. Into this fervent atmosphere came the Hudsons. Patrick arrived in 1834 with his wife Kathleen and younger brother Sean. He was 38 tall, with sharp gray eyes and prematurely white hair that gave him a prophetic air. Kathleen, 3 years younger, had a cold sculptural beauty, pale, sharp-featured, and distant. Sean, at 25, had the innocent face of a choir boy, and the soft-spoken charm that made him seem angelic, an illusion that would later prove deadly. They came bearing glowing recommendations. Patrick especially impressed local ministers with his rhetoric on moral correction. His vision, a home where fallen women could be redeemed through prayer labor and ritual purification. Reform homes were common at the time, but Patrick's religious intensity set his proposal apart. He promised spiritual healing, not just punishment. The community welcomed them. When Patrick bought a crumbling colonial mansion just outside Kingston, a relic of the Dutch settlers, the town saw it as a sign from God. The house, aged but grand, became the perfect stage for what they thought was a mission of mercy. But behind its doors, mercy turned to madness. Built in 1712 by Dutch merchant Cornelius Vanderburg, the mansion stood on 47 secluded acres wrapped in dense forest that offered perfect isolation. Its thick stone walls, narrow windows, and multi-level layout made it ideal for dormitories, workshops, and administrative control. Most chillingly, the mansion included a sprawling cellar, what Patrick Hudson would call contemplation chambers, where the most troubled women could reflect in solitary prayer. By summer 1834, the Hudsons had transformed the once abandoned estate into a fully functioning institution. Patrick supervised structural changes, adding locks to doors and bars to windows, all under the guise of protecting residents from themselves. Kathleen designed a strict daily regimen: prayers at dawn, labor, until dusk, meals eaten in silence. Sean, trained at a small theological seminary in Connecticut, developed the spiritual curriculum that would anchor their so-called treatment program. Local leaders watched with approval. Ministers admired Patrick's scriptural approach to rehabilitation. And Judge Hendrik Schuyler praised his detailed plans and willingness to take on women deemed beyond redemption. When the House of Religious Correction for Wayward Women opened that October, The Ulster County Gazette hailed it as a sanctuary of hope, a final chance for society's fallen daughters. The Hudsons refused government funding, instead soliciting private donations and fees from families desperate to preserve their reputations. The first arrival came on a gray November morning. 19-year-old Margaret Sutherland, the daughter of a prosperous merchant, had been caught in what her father described as a shameful affair with a married man. Rather than endure scandal, he delivered her to the Hudsons, paying handsomely for what he believed would be a year of redemptive discipline. Margaret stepped inside that towering mansion and vanished from public life. Her father received monthly letters penned in her hand, assuring him that her rehabilitation was proceeding as planned. He died never knowing that Margaret had become the first victim in a twisted system built not on salvation, but on controlled cruelty and silence. From the moment she arrived, Margaret's transformation began. It would take 33 years before anyone understood what the Hudsons meant by purification. That first night, with rain lashing the stone windows, Margaret faced the reality of what lay ahead, later described in her sworn 1867 testimony as the threshold of hell. Patrick greeted her in the grand parlor, where heavy beams spanned the ceiling and firelight flickered across faded Dutch paintings and painted scripture. Clad in black, he softened his stern features with a smile of false compassion. "Miss Sutherland," he said in a voice honed from years of preaching, "you come to us as Magdalene came to Christ, broken by sin, yet longing for redemption. Your Father has entrusted your soul to us, and we will not fail him." Kathleen entered her presence as commanding as it was cold. Dressed in severe black with a silver cross at her collar, she evaluated Margaret like a farmer inspecting livestock. "The first step is humility," she declared. "You will surrender your belongings. Vanity has no place in a house of repentance." Margaret tried to resist, but her objections were met with soothing persistence. Sean emerged from the shadows, his kind demeanor masking darker intentions. "I understand your fear," he said, his voice calm and intimate. "Satan urges you to run from salvation. But we've helped many souls like yours. Trust in the Lord and trust us. We are his humble servants." What followed haunted Margaret for the rest of her life. She was taken to the preparation chamber, a sealed, lightless room deep in the basement. There, alone with the Hudsons, she underwent the first ritual of the institution's so-called purification process, and that was only the beginning. The chamber had once been a root cellar, now converted into what Patrick Hudson called a contemplation room. Moisture dripped from its stone walls despite attempts to make it more comfortable. Dim candlelight cast shadows across surfaces adorned with crosses, biblical verses, and paintings of hellish torment and heavenly reward. Margaret was ordered to undress and don a plain gray shift embroidered with the words, "Penitent Soul." Her hair was trimmed to a modest length, her belongings locked in a wooden box, supposedly to be returned upon completion of her rehabilitation. Then the true nature of the institution began to reveal itself. Shivering in the cold air, Margaret was subjected to what Kathleen called an examination of moral corruption. A physical inspection masquerading as a spiritual assessment. "Sin," Kathleen said flatly, "leaves its mark on the body as well as the soul." What followed was a clinical violation carried out under the mask of Christian duty. Margaret was measured, prodded, and cataloged in a leather-bound journal. Questions about her sexual history, menstruation, and bodily responses were framed as necessary steps in designing her path to purity. The psychological assault was just as calculated. Sean Hudson conducted what he called a spiritual interview, gently unraveling Margaret's sense of self under the guise of pastoral care. "Tell me," he said softly, "when did the devil first tempt your heart?" His voice was kind, his questions invasive. He spoke as if salvation lay just beyond confession, if only Margaret could surrender entirely. By the time she was shown to a small dormitory, she would share with 3 other women. Margaret had been thoroughly broken, stripped of identity, privacy, and dignity. The Hudsons had exerted complete control over her body and mind, all while cloaked in the language of compassion. She was no longer a daughter of privilege. She was a penitent soul, one of many soon to follow. What Margaret couldn't yet understand was that every part of her intake had been designed for one purpose: submission. The Hudsons had perfected this process, exploiting religious ritual as both weapon and shield. Who would question such devout Christians laboring to save fallen women from sin? That first night, lying awake to the sound of muffled sobs and strange noises echoing through the corridors, Margaret began to suspect that her father had delivered her not to salvation, but into something far more terrifying. And by then, it was already too late. By the winter of 1834, the Hudsons had established a daily rhythm for their institution, one that blended religious fervor with psychological domination. Margaret's experience became the template for all who followed. Every woman who entered the mansion faced the same process: stripped down spiritually, dismantled, then rebuilt under the Hudsons' total control. Patrick's genius wasn't in his cruelty. It was in how he weaponized respectability. He had studied legitimate reform houses, identifying where their methods could be twisted for exploitation. Morning prayers became mental conditioning. Bible studies drilled in the virtues of obedience and the cleansing power of suffering. Physical labor meant to instill discipline, drained the women's strength, and fed the family's income. By spring 1835, the house held 12 women, aged 16 to 31. Most were sent by families desperate to erase a scandal. Daughters disgraced by affairs, wives abandoned after infidelity, unmarried women condemned by pregnancy. Each family paid dearly for their silence. They received cheerful letters in their daughter's handwriting, each eerily similar, each assuring them all was well. Visiting was strongly discouraged, framed as disruptive to the soul's healing journey. The daily schedule was rigid. Wake up at 5 a.m. for chapel prayers led by Hudson, whose sermons harped on women's sinful nature and the need for submission. Breakfast was meager porridge and weak tea, followed by 6 hours of work. The women sewed fine needlework, preserved food, and made crafts Kathleen sold to wealthy families across the Hudson Valley. Their craftsmanship was excellent, their labor unpaid, their pain unseen. This was not salvation. It was slavery wrapped in scripture, and it had only just begun. Fear, it turned out, was an incredible motivator. Under the Hudson family's regime, even desperation could become profitable. The women's handcrafted goods sold throughout the Hudson Valley brought in a steady stream of income, augmented by the high fees families paid for moral rehabilitation. Officially, the House of Religious Correction claimed to be a Christian charity. Unofficially, it was a business built on domination. But it was after dark that the mansion's true purpose was revealed. Following the evening meal and prayers, the residents were led to the basement chambers for what Patrick Hudson called individualized spiritual therapy. These sessions, presented as vital to the purification process, took place in heavily altered cellar rooms, originally built for storage, but now repurposed into something far more sinister. The basement had been remodeled throughout the fall of 1834 into a warren of rooms tailored to the family's needs. The largest, dubbed the Sanctuary of Purification, was filled with crosses, paintings of damnation, and padded restraints Patrick claimed were needed to help the women resist sinful temptations during therapy. Smaller adjoining rooms, thick-walled and soundproof, were used for private counseling. At first, the sessions appeared genuine. Margaret Sutherland recalled Hudson opening each one with quiet conversation about her spiritual progress, gently pressing her to confess, reflect, and identify lingering moral weaknesses. But these were not conversations. They were psychological evaluations, cold, calculated efforts to locate each woman's breaking point. Sean could see through you, Margaret testified in 1867. He knew exactly what you feared, what you hated about yourself. And he would use scripture and shame to make you believe that obedience to him was obedience to God. As the sessions progressed, the physical component intensified. Kathleen Hudson claimed experience in female health and performed what she called spiritual examinations procedures that served no medical purpose but were masked as essential to moral healing. Sin, she insisted, left impurities in the body just as it did in the soul. The women, starved for reassurance and beaten down by months of ritual control, believed her. We trusted her, Margaret said, because she spoke with such certainty. We believed our suffering had purpose, that it was God's will. But behind the veil of piety, the Hudsons were constructing something more grotesque than even Margaret could have imagined. By summer 1835, the institution's population had grown to 20 women. That was when Patrick quietly launched the darkest phase of his operation, a program he referred to privately as the Redemption Service. Wealthy men from across New York and New England were invited to participate in what they were told were spiritual guidance sessions, opportunities to counsel fallen women and contribute to their rehabilitation. In reality, these men were buying sexual access, under the pretense of Christian charity. They were told their donations funded the women's care. They were led to believe that their prayers and counsel hastened moral recovery. And the women, broken by months of manipulation, were told that compliance was part of their training for life after release. Submission, they were taught, was a virtue, and resistance was a sign of spiritual failure. Patrick cultivated his clients carefully. These were men who found comfort in the illusion that their desires were sanctified, that they were saviors, not predators. And the Hudsons gave them exactly what they wanted: redemption at a price. Margaret remembered how this next level of coercion blurred the lines between salvation and abuse. They told us it was our duty, she said, that we were practicing the obedience we'd need as wives. If we resisted, they punished us. If we obeyed, they promised we were one step closer to going home. The mental toll was devastating. For women who had spent months being told their value came from obedience and suffering, the line between punishment and purification disappeared entirely. We needed to believe it meant something, Margaret later confessed. Because if it didn't, if we weren't being saved, then we were just victims in a nightmare we couldn't wake up from. As 1835 turned into 1836, the House of Religious Correction was thriving. Donations poured in. Local churches applauded the Hudsons' piety. Judge Schuyler continued to refer families with moral scandals to the institution, pointing to their success in turning ruined lives around. Ministers praised their charitable contributions to mission work. No one asked what happened behind the mansion's locked doors. But inside, a machine of cruelty had reached peak efficiency. The Hudson family had created a system of spiritual terrorism that combined religious manipulation, psychological torture, and sexual exploitation into a seamless, self-sustaining institution. They knew how to break people. They knew how to hide their methods behind faith. And worst of all, they knew that no one wanted to look too closely, because to do so would mean questioning the righteousness of those who claim to act in God's name. With every new arrival, every whispered prayer, and every locked door, the shadows inside the Hudson mansion grew deeper. And outside, the community only saw the glow of virtue. What began as Margaret Sutherland's personal nightmare was evolving into something far larger, a system of abuse that would ultimately destroy hundreds of lives, all under the shield of religious legitimacy. And still, the worst was yet to come. In 1836, the House of Religious Correction underwent quiet but alarming transformations. The Hudson family's operation, once a crude network of exploitation, was now expanding with precision. becoming more organized, more profitable, and more terrifying. The first visible sign was construction. Patrick Hudson announced that due to overwhelming demand for their moral rehabilitation program, new facilities were being built to accommodate more women. Locals, unaware of the truth, saw dormitories and workshops rising on the estate and praised the Hudsons for their continued charity. But the reality was far darker. The building, labeled the Advanced Therapy Center, was designed for the expansion of Patrick's most lucrative enterprise, the Redemption Service. It featured private rooms with separate entrances, allowing wealthy clients to come and go unseen. Soundproofed walls ensured that no screams or cries would betray the horrors within. The second structure, known as the Contemplation Retreat, was even more sinister. Built to house women who resisted or tried to escape it, contained isolated cells for intensive spiritual counseling. Its basement held what Patrick called purification chambers rooms, reserved for the most extreme punishments, hidden even from most staff and residents. Margaret Sutherland, now 18 months into her confinement, watched this transformation with a kind of numb terror. The girl who had once resisted was gone. She had learned the cost of defiance. By 1836, she later testified, "I no longer knew who I was. I wasn't surviving, I was obeying." She had seen the consequences. Women who resisted were taken away, allegedly transferred to other institutions, or returned to family. But no one ever heard from them again. Others spent weeks in the basement, emerging shattered, compliant, and terrified of being sent back. Some simply disappeared. These vanishings began quietly in late 1835, but their full horror wouldn't come to light for decades. Patrick Hudson had developed what he referred to as advanced placement programs. Families were told their daughters had graduated, been transferred, or placed in domestic service in distant cities. In truth, they were being sold. The Hudsons had formed ties with criminal networks in New York and beyond, traffickers who paid handsomely for women already broken by months of psychological abuse. Some were sold into brothels. Others were murdered when deemed too great a risk. These disappearances were managed with chilling efficiency. To maintain the illusion, families received letters supposedly written by their daughters. Joyful updates about spiritual renewal and new beginnings. But the letters were forgeries. Sean Hudson, with his deep knowledge of each woman's speech patterns and handwriting, crafted every word. He had studied them during intake, collecting samples, noting vocabulary, mimicking tone. His forgeries were so convincing that even the most skeptical parents believed them. And so the truth remained hidden. Sean was the most dangerous of them all, Margaret said. Patrick was cruel. Kathleen was cold. But Sean made you believe that your suffering was sacred. He smiled as he described torture as love. He convinced us that humiliation was holiness, that pain was proof of salvation. By autumn 1836, the House of Religious Correction housed 37 women, making it one of the largest moral reform institutions in New York State. Its reputation was sterling. Local ministers praised the Hudsons' work. Judges referred more families. And the institution's financial success was undeniable. Their profits came from every angle: the handcrafted goods made by the residents, the large fees from desperate families, and the obscene income generated by the Redemption Service. What the community saw was a sanctuary. What the residents knew was a prison. And behind every sermon, every prayer, every promise of redemption was a lie wrapped in scripture and sharpened into a weapon. By late 1836, the Hudson family's enterprise had matured into something far more dangerous than a cruel institution. It was a machine wealthy, respected, and deeply embedded in Ulster County's religious and social structure. Patrick had begun investing his growing profits across the region, purchasing land, funding businesses, and forging alliances that insulated his family from suspicion. Their influence reached into church pulpits and courthouse benches. Patrick was invited to speak at ministerial conferences on the subject of moral reform. Kathleen became a sought-after advisor among women leading charitable initiatives. Shaw, his soft voice and theological sophistication earning widespread admiration, was being seriously considered for ordination. In public, the Hudsons embodied everything their community wanted to believe about redemption and righteous discipline. Behind that pristine facade, however, their operation had evolved into a well-oiled system of exploitation. What had started as opportunistic abuse had grown into a vast criminal enterprise, rooted in religious authority. They had refined techniques of psychological domination, perfected systems for eliminating dissent, and maintained a stream of forged letters to keep families believing their daughters were thriving. Worst of all, the Hudsons believed their own myth. Patrick saw himself not as a predator, but as a savior, cleansing communities of moral filth and putting ruined women to productive use. Kathleen believed she was pioneering a new science of female psychology, learning how to subdue and direct women's behavior. Sean viewed his work as a divine calling, a sacred mission to restore order to fallen souls. Their shared delusion that every act of cruelty was an act of charity made them not only more dangerous, but more untouchable. As winter deepened in 1836, the women imprisoned inside the House of Religious Correction were left with the grim realization that escape was unlikely, and rescue even less so. Margaret Sutherland had stopped dreaming of freedom. "We lived only to avoid punishment," she later testified. The idea that someone might find us, might stop them, felt like a fantasy we didn't dare believe in. But then, in February 1837, someone did come. The New York State Commission on Charitable Institutions, recently formed in response to scandals at other reform facilities, had launched statewide inspections. Their mandate to investigate institutions serving multiple counties or receiving public referrals. Among the first locations flagged for review was the Hudson family's operation. Commissioner Henry Caldwell, a veteran attorney from Albany, arrived in Kingston on a frigid morning with 2 assistants and a briefcase of concerns. 17 families had contacted the commission with troubling but vague complaints. Extended stays, lack of visitation, and eerily similar letters, all pointing to the House of Religious Correction. None made specific accusations, Caldwell later wrote. But the pattern was undeniable. Too many parents, too many unanswered questions. Patrick Hudson received advance warning through his local network. Judge Schuyler, who had recommended dozens of families to the institution, quietly informed Patrick that an inspection was imminent. It was the first real threat the Hudsons had faced. Panic set in immediately. For over 2 years, the Hudsons had operated under the shield of religious reverence. They believed themselves untouchable. Now, for the first time, they had to reckon with the possibility that their empire was vulnerable. Patrick initiated what he called emergency protocols, drastic measures designed to erase or disguise the truth. The basement chambers were stripped of restraints and decor converted to look like ordinary storage rooms. Medical devices were repurposed crosses and torments removed. The Advanced Therapy Center was rebranded overnight, its private rooms refitted to resemble dormitories. All client access records were hidden or destroyed. But the most horrifying response was reserved for the residents themselves. Those who had been held the longest, those who had seen the worst, were deemed liabilities. Patrick began transferring them to what he called satellite facilities. In reality, they were either sold to criminal contacts or murdered outright. There could be no risk of survivors telling the truth. They didn't just erase evidence, Margaret Sutherland would later testify. They erased us. By the time Commissioner Caldwell arrived at the estate, the Hudsons had done everything possible to present the image of a clean, compassionate institution. But as he would soon discover, no amount of preparation could hide the rot beneath the surface forever. The reckoning had begun. and the House of Religious Correction was about to enter the most desperate and violent chapter of its terrible history. Margaret Sutherland, now in her 3rd year at the House of Religious Correction, had become a liability. She knew too much. On the night before Commissioner Henry Caldwell's scheduled inspection, she and 11 other long-term residents, each of them witnesses to the institution's darkest practices, were loaded into covered wagons and sent away. Their destination was never revealed. "I knew that night we were going to die," Margaret would later testify. "They always pretended we might one day be released, but something in Patrick's eyes told me that lie was over. We weren't patients. We were threats. But fate intervened. During the journey, the wagon carrying Margaret broke down near the property of Samuel Hartwell, a Quaker minister known for his quiet skepticism about the Hudson institution. Troubled by rumors and inconsistencies, Hartwell had long suspected something was wrong behind the Hudson's polished facade. When he saw Margaret thin, bruised, and visibly terrified, he recognized instantly that she was not being saved. She was being silenced. "Brother Hartwell saved my life," Margaret recalled. "He saw what they'd done to me, and he didn't hesitate." Hartwell refused to let the guards continue. He took Margaret into his home, contacted allies in the abolitionist movement, and secured protection for her among a network of people experienced in rescuing victims from abusive institutions. Just hours later, while Margaret was being sheltered and debriefed, Commissioner Caldwell arrived at the House of Religious Correction. Patrick Hudson welcomed him with his usual blend of self-righteous piety and carefully crafted transparency. The facilities were immaculate. Select residents coached for days gave glowing accounts of their treatment. Financial records had been sanitized to show only charitable income and modest expenses. But Caldwell was not easily fooled. He noted that the women he spoke to seemed anxious and rehearsed. The records showed unusually high income for a non-profit institution. Modifications to the building's thick stone walls, soundproofed rooms, raised questions about their actual function. Most troubling of all were the placement records. Over 30 women were said to have completed rehabilitation and entered domestic service in the past year, yet none of their families had received visits, updates, or credible proof of their whereabouts. When Caldwell asked to see their correspondence, Sean Hudson produced letters that seemed legitimate until Caldwell noticed something strange. The vocabulary was too consistent, he wrote. The structure, the phrasing, different handwriting, yes, but one voice. When Caldwell requested family contacts to verify these letters, Sean claimed confidentiality laws prevented disclosure, an explanation that contradicted the institution's stated mission of family reunification. Caldwell pressed further, asking to examine areas that had clearly been modified hastily, noting inconsistencies in their stories and documents. And then news reached Patrick Hudson. Margaret Sutherland had been found alive and was speaking. That revelation triggered full-blown panic. Patrick, normally calculating and composed, began issuing desperate orders. He sent men to Hartwell's farm with instructions to retrieve Margaret by any means necessary, even force. At the same time, he began plotting Commissioner Caldwell's murder, hoping to stage it as a worrier as a winter travel accident or bandit attack. Kathleen, detached and clinical as ever, became obsessed with preserving her personal records. She spent days burning documents that could implicate them, while carefully saving what she considered research-twisted journals detailing the psychological responses of the women they had broken. She believed, even at the brink of exposure, that her work had scientific value. Sean's mask cracked completely. The once gentle counselor became volatile and menacing. He initiated what he called emergency spiritual counseling private sessions, meant to silence any resident who might consider speaking out. His threats were direct and terrifying. Sean was the worst of them. In the end, one survivor recalled, "He didn't yell. He didn't hit. He just looked you in the eye and said, "If you talk, we'll send you somewhere worse. Somewhere that'll make this place feel like paradise." As the Hudson family unraveled under the weight of impending exposure, they descended into paranoia, desperation, and cruelty even more brutal than before. But what they didn't realize was that Margaret Sutherland's testimony and Commissioner Caldwell's suspicion had already set the wheels in motion. Their empire of exploitation was about to collapse. Before justice could be served, the Hudson family would make one last desperate move to preserve their empire, an act of defiance that would expose the full depths of their depravity and leave scars on Ulster County for generations. On the morning of February 18th, 1837, Justice Commissioner Henry Caldwell prepared to expand his investigation. News reached the House of Religious Correction that shattered the illusion of control. Margaret Sutherland was alive, and worse, she was cooperating with Quaker abolitionists who were documenting her testimony. The revelation struck the Hudson family like a thunderclap. The myth they had so carefully crafted was unraveling. Patrick Hudson responded the only way he knew how, with force. He dispatched his most loyal men, not counselors, but enforcers, hardened criminals who had been part of the institution's machinery of abuse for years. Their orders were clear silence, Margaret, at any cost. But the Quakers were not unprepared. Samuel Hartwell and his network were part of the Underground Railroad, experienced in protecting those fleeing violence and oppression. When Hudson's men arrived at the Hartwell farm, they were met not by frightened pacifists, but by armed abolitionists ready to defend their charge. The attempted raid on Hartwell's farm became the first open act of violence in a conflict that would rip away the last remnants of the Hudsons' religious mask. When Commissioner Caldwell learned that the Hudson family had sent armed agents to retrieve a witness, he understood at once this was no longer about institutional malpractice. He was uncovering something far worse, a criminal syndicate operating under the protection of piety. Back at the Hudson estate, the atmosphere collapsed into chaos. With their control slipping, the family abandoned all pretense. Sean Hudson began what he called final purification ritual sessions, designed not to rehabilitate, but to terrorize. Gone was the soft-spoken counselor. In his place stood a man consumed by hatred and desperation. "If this place closes," he warned the residents, "you'll be sent somewhere far worse. Somewhere no one will ever find you." We believed him, survivor Sarah Peaton later said. He described horrors that made what we were living through seem merciful. Kathleen Hudson detached, and eerily calm turned inward. Rather than confront the looming collapse of their empire, she obsessed over her research, meticulously organizing her journals and psychological data. She truly believed her methods had scientific value, Margaret recalled. She talked about her work as if it would change the future for women, as if torturing us was part of some noble cause. As word of the attempted assault on the Hartwell farm spread, Caldwell realized he was facing a conspiracy that reached beyond the Hudson family. The men who'd attacked were not outsiders. They were part of a well-oiled system shielded by years of religious authority and community endorsement. He requested reinforcements and expanded the investigation to uncover all those connected to the institution's operations. The truth that emerged would shock even the most hardened investigators. The House of Religious Correction had not merely been a rogue institution. It was the center of a sophisticated criminal empire, one that combined human trafficking, sexual exploitation, fraud, and murder beneath the banner of moral reform. Its victims numbered in the hundreds, its profit immense, and its influence far-reaching. But before the full extent of their crimes could be revealed, the Hudsons launched one final offensive. They began erasing everything. Witnesses were targeted. Evidence was destroyed. Letters were burned. Records disappeared. Patrick believed that if he moved fast enough, if he was ruthless enough, he could still salvage the empire he had built on pain and fear. The battle for Margaret Sutherland's testimony became the symbolic struggle for every soul the Hudson family had tried to erase. If she could speak, if her truth was heard, then the suffering of those trapped behind the institution's walls would finally have meaning. If not, the shadows would close once again. That final confrontation came on February 25th, 1837, during a blizzard so brutal it would go down as one of the worst in Ulster County's history, and it would mark the moment when the Hudson family's sins could no longer remain buried. The blizzard that descended on Ulster County on February 25th, 1837, was the worst storm in decades and the perfect cover for what Patrick Hudson intended to be his final act, the erasure of every trace of his crimes. What unfolded that night was not an escape, but a scorched earth plan to annihilate all witnesses, all evidence, and anyone who stood in the way. It was the full, unmasked horror of an empire built on exploitation and its final desperate collapse. By then, Commissioner Caldwell had established temporary headquarters at the Kingston Courthouse. With federal marshals and local law enforcement now involved, the investigation had become the largest criminal inquiry in New York State's history. Margaret Sutherland's testimony, recorded, corroborated, and undeniable, was at the heart of it. But Patrick Hudson would not let the empire fall without a fight. Using the wealth he had hoarded over years of trafficking and abuse, he assembled a private army of criminals, corrupt officials, and desperate men bound to him by guilt and greed. The plan was ruthless: eliminate the witnesses, destroy the evidence, and vanish into legend, leaving behind a ruin that could be blamed on tragic circumstance. The attacks began at midnight as the storm raged. Hudson's forces struck on 3 fronts: the Kingston Courthouse, where Caldwell and his team were reviewing records; the Hartwell Farm, where Margaret Sutherland and her protectors sheltered; and the House of Religious Correction itself, where 23 remaining women were seen not as victims, but liabilities. At the courthouse, Patrick himself led a group of men posing as federal marshals. They gained entry with forged credentials and opened fire. Commissioner Caldwell was shot twice and nearly killed, but was saved by local militia who responded to the gunfire. The attackers fled, leaving behind chaos and blood. At the Hartwell Farm, the violence was even worse. Sean Hudson, unrecognizable from his former gentle persona, led the assault personally. The Quaker abolitionists fought back, but they were outgunned. The farmhouse was set ablaze during the battle, forcing defenders to choose between fire and bullets. Margaret escaped, but not without loss. Samuel Hartwell and 2 others died shielding her. But the true horror of that night unfolded back at the mansion. Kathleen Hudson, faced with the collapse of her life's work, chose to destroy every remaining resident. She had long prepared for such a moment. That night she poisoned the evening meal with arsenic, a stash she had quietly accumulated over months. She prepared that meal with her usual calm, testified survivor, Rebecca Dalton. She gave a sermon as she served us, saying our deaths would purify our souls and complete our redemption. But Kathleen had miscalculated. The poison did not kill swiftly. Within hours, the women were writhing in agony. Screams echoed through the halls. Some begged for help, others prayed. A few too sick to eat were spared. The rest suffered through a night of excruciating pain, slowly realizing that the promise of salvation had always been a lie. When Patrick returned from the failed courthouse attack, he found his empire in ashes. Caldwell had survived. Law enforcement reinforcements were closing in. Several of his men had been killed or arrested. Margaret Sutherland had not only survived, but escaped with new witnesses. The illusion was over, but Patrick Hudson didn't run. He didn't surrender. Instead, he chose annihilation. In a final act of madness, he turned the mansion into a funeral pyre. He doused the wooden floors with lamp oil, stacked ledgers and journals as kindling, and composed a final written testament, an unhinged justification for decades of cruelty. He claimed he had been misunderstood, that society had rejected his vision, that the suffering he inflicted had been necessary for moral salvation. He believed until the end that he was a prophet. Patrick Hudson's final statement declared his life's purpose the purification of fallen women through what he called sacred work. He claimed society lacked the courage to accept the drastic measures required for such redemption, insisting future generations would one day recognize the necessity of complete submission to divine authority. His mission ended in fire on the morning of February 26, 1837, when the House of Religious Correction was consumed by flames. As a blizzard eased and daylight exposed the wreckage, both Patrick and his brother Shaw perished. Shaw having returned from a failed raid to partake in what they believed was their final stand. Kathleen Hudson survived, though she was caught trying to escape with a wagon loaded with documents and personal effects. Her arrest ended the Hudson family's reign, but the horrors they orchestrated were just beginning to come to light. The charred remains of the house continued to smolder for days, a haunting symbol of 3 years of cruelty masked as Christian reform. Though the fire destroyed much survivor testimonies, especially from Margaret Sutherland, preserved the truth of what had occurred behind those walls. The investigation that followed became one of the most extensive in early American history. Led by Commissioner Henry Caldwell, despite his injuries from an earlier courthouse attack, the inquiry involved federal, state, and local agents. They uncovered financial records showing the institution had earned more than $47,000 from 1834 to 1837. A fortune built on human trafficking, forced labor, sexual exploitation, and deceit. The money came from family payments, product sales, client access fees, and trafficking of women to brothels and criminal rings. Perhaps most disturbing were Kathleen Hudson's research notes, which survived both her attempt to flee and the fire itself. These documents revealed a chillingly methodical study of psychological control and abuse. Written with scientific detachment, they outlined techniques for dismantling a person's autonomy and described experiments on how various abuses affected women with different personalities. Commissioner Caldwell noted that her work represented a uniquely deliberate and scientific approach to human degradation. Survivors' accounts, especially Margaret Sutherland's, gave human voice to the grim facts. Her testimony became central to understanding how the Hudsons masked their abuse as religious care. Dr. Samuel Richardson, a pioneer in the study of psychological trauma, observed that Sutherland's account showed how spiritual guidance could be weaponized, manipulating victims into complicity through structured systems of reward and punishment. Kathleen Hudson's trial attracted international attention, raising difficult legal and moral questions about prosecuting crimes committed under the guise of charity. Medical experts debated whether her emotionless demeanor indicated insanity or a deeply rooted moral void. Kathleen appeared confused by the accusations, insisting her work had scientific merit and moral value. She expressed sorrow only that her studies had ended prematurely, not for the suffering they caused. Her courtroom statements revealed a mind so detached from empathy that even her own defense could not portray her as anything but monstrous. She claimed her goal had been to understand the female mind and cure moral failings, words that only deepened the horror of her legacy. Every woman who entered our care was already corrupted by sin, Kathleen Hudson insisted. To outsiders, her methods may have appeared cruel, but she defended them as carefully tailored treatments, products of observation, experimentation, and what she called scientific discipline. Each woman, she claimed, received a unique regimen designed to correct her psychological failings. Kathleen's 6-week trial drew crowds from across the region, many eager to catch a glimpse of the woman the press had dubbed the Ulster County She-Devil. Her crimes shocked even the most hardened legal observers. She was convicted on multiple counts, including murder, kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy to commit acts of moral turpitude under the veil of religious duty. Her sentence, death by hanging, marked one of the earliest instances in New York history, where a woman was executed for crimes committed under the guise of spiritual authority. On November 15, 1838, Kathleen Hudson was hanged. She remained composed until the end, never wavering in her belief that her work was both morally justified and scientifically valid. She refused to speak publicly, but her final written statement read aloud by the prison chaplain reaffirmed her conviction that her methods had been necessary. Innovations misunderstood by a society unwilling to confront the darker truths of human nature. The investigation that followed unearthed a vast web of complicity. The Hudson family's influence extended far beyond Stir County, reaching into courts, churches, and commercial circles across New York and New England. Over 40 individuals, including judges, clergymen, and businessmen, were prosecuted for knowingly supporting or profiting from the Hudsons' criminal enterprise. The scandal sparked sweeping reforms in the oversight of religious and charitable institutions, ushering in mandatory inspections, detailed documentation, and independent audits. These Hudson reforms set a precedent that spread to other states and established a vital legal principle: religious authority could never serve as a shield for criminal behavior. Central to the unraveling of the Hudson's operation was the testimony of Margaret Sutherland. Her bravery not only exposed the depth of the abuse, but reshaped the national conversation around institutional power and survivor advocacy. In 1839, she married Thomas Hartwell, son of Samuel Hartwell, whose farm had once been targeted by the Hudsons. Together, they worked with Quaker organizations to support women escaping similar institutions. In 1845, Margaret published a memoir that offered one of the first comprehensive accounts of psychological abuse disguised as spiritual correction. Her writing helped establish new legal standards for prosecuting crimes committed under the banner of religion. The physical site of the House of Religious Correction was never rebuilt. Its scorched remains stood as a grim monument until time and scavengers gradually dismantled them. Locals repurposed its stones for new structures, almost as if erasing the place could erase the memory. Yet the psychological scars endured. Across New York, the public's trust in religious institutions was shaken. Churches faced mounting scrutiny, and families grew hesitant to entrust vulnerable loved ones to private care. The Hudson case had exposed how easily faith and charity could be twisted into tools of exploitation. The legal consequences were just as lasting. The court's ruling that religious authority offered no immunity from justice became a cornerstone in future prosecutions of clergy abuse. Kathleen's meticulous records of psychological manipulation became early case studies in trauma-based control. More than anything, the case revealed a disturbing truth: the Hudsons had thrived, not because they were cunning, but because they knew how to exploit people's belief in redemption. They offered a story of salvation, one that communities wanted to believe, even as the evidence pointed to something far more sinister. As Dr. Samuel Richardson wrote in his later analysis, the true danger was not deception, but the willful denial of reality. Evil, he argued, often gains power not because good people are fooled, but because they choose to ignore what they cannot bear to believe. The residents of Ulster County weren't naive. They were hopeful. And in their hope, they gave cover to horrors committed in the name of grace. The Hudson family thrived by exploiting a deep societal hunger for moral certainty, using the protective veil of religious authority to commit crimes that would have been unthinkable in any other context. Their exposure forced the nation to confront a harrowing question: how many other institutions, cloaked in the language of charity and salvation, might be committing similar abuses in secret? Commissioner Caldwell's investigation raised disturbing answers. His team identified at least a dozen other facilities across New York and New England, exhibiting troubling patterns reminiscent of the House of Religious Correction. While none matched the Hudsons' full scope of criminality, several were found to be engaged in financial fraud, unethical treatment practices, abuse, and the exploitation of their residents. The Hudson case was not an isolated horror. It was a symptom of a wider systemic failure. Its legacy rippled far beyond legal proceedings and policy reforms. The case became a national reference point in debates about the unchecked power of religious institutions, the dangers of blind faith, and the ease with which the vulnerable can be manipulated under the guise of spiritual care. It marked a turning point in how American society viewed institutional oversight, establishing a growing consensus that charity, especially when tied to religious authority, must be held to rigorous standards of transparency and accountability. Just as importantly, the Hudson case provided early insight into the mechanics of psychological domination. The tactics used within the House of Religious Correction, coercive control, emotional deconstruction, forced dependency, would later become foundational to the study of totalitarian regimes and trauma-based systems of control. For the women who escaped that nightmare, liberation was only the first step in a lifelong journey of healing. Many struggled with what would now be recognized as complex psychological trauma, finding it difficult to trust, to form relationships, or to live without fear. Margaret Sutherland captured this anguish in her memoir. We had been taught to distrust our own perceptions, to doubt our own worth, and to accept suffering as evidence of spiritual progress. Learning to think and feel for ourselves again took years. Some of us never fully returned to the people we had once been. The state of New York, under mounting public pressure and legal precedent, eventually issued over $200,000 in compensation to families whose daughters had been victimized by the Hudsons, an unprecedented sum at the time. These payments not only recognized the state's failure to prevent systemic abuse, but also established a powerful legal principle. Governments bore responsibility when their institutions enabled cruelty through negligence or complicity. Culturally, the Hudson case echoed through American society for generations. It inspired novels, exposés, sermons, and reform campaigns. Writers, journalists, and activists seized on the case as proof of how easily moral authority could be weaponized, and how communities eager to believe in virtue often became accomplices to silent horrors by refusing to question those who claimed to serve the public good. The Hudsons did not just corrupt a single institution, they revealed how fragile the line between salvation and abuse can become when power goes unchecked. As time passed and the immediate shock of the Hudson revelations faded, the case slipped into the realm of Ulster County folklore. Stories of the House of Religious Correction were passed down through generations, increasingly warped by myth and superstition. Some claimed the mansion was haunted by the spirits of its victims. Others whispered that Patrick Hudson had made unholy pacts to maintain control over the women under his care. These supernatural tales, while understandable attempts to make sense of unfathomable cruelty, ultimately softened the truth, burying the real horror beneath layers of fiction. Because the truth was far more disturbing than any ghost story. This was not the work of madmen or monsters. It was the deliberate, calculated destruction of lives by three intelligent, educated people who convinced themselves and their community that they were serving God. What happened at the House of Religious Correction revealed a terrifying reality that evil often hides not behind masks or madness, but behind moral conviction. Patrick, Kathleen, and Shaw Hudson were not anomalies. They were people who understood how to exploit trust, how to use shame and faith as tools, and how to weaponize religious authority to protect themselves while dismantling the souls of their victims. They succeeded for 3 long years because they understood human nature, how families will sacrifice truth to preserve their reputations, how communities crave the comfort of redemption stories, and how institutions cloaked in morality are often shielded from scrutiny. Their legacy is not just one of horror, but of warning. The Hudson case remains urgently relevant. It reminds us that when organizations demand secrecy under the banner of righteousness, when families are discouraged from asking questions, and when suffering is repackaged as moral growth, those are the conditions in which systematic abuse takes root and thrives. The Hudsons were eventually exposed, but only after they had inflicted unimaginable harm, and only because a few brave voices refused to stay silent. They remind us that the most terrifying monsters in American history weren't creatures in the dark or killers in the night. They were people who believed they were doing good, who learned to commit evil in the name of virtue. And they make us ask, was everything truly uncovered? Or were there others, other institutions, other families who operated under similar facades of charity and faith, while hiding decades of abuse behind locked doors? What do you think? Was the Hudson case just the beginning? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts on how communities can protect themselves from those who know how to manipulate moral authority. If this story gripped you and you want more tales of horror buried in the margins of American history, subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll uncover another forgotten chapter from the shadowed past when the official records hoped you'd never find.
Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.